3.10 for the Helix, Line 6 has added a ton of new effects and features, and most notably in my opinion is the addition of the dynamic hall reverb. This is a reverb with a lot of advanced parameters, and even within each parameter you have a huge range that you can select. The upside to this is that we can get very specific and we can use one block to cover a wide range of reverb tones versus before when we would use separate reverb blocks and consume a lot of DSP that way. The downside is that you can experience option paralysis if you don't quite understand each of the advanced parameters. And in fact, as you play with a reverb and you start really experimenting with stuff, you'll find that within each parameter, there's kind of a sweet spot that'll cover 90% of your reverb tones. So the point of this video is, number one, I'll show you a couple of my favorite settings. I came up with a couple different snapshots that you'll be able to see all the settings on the screen and just copy them over to your device. And then number two, this video will also just serve kind of as an introduction to the advanced reverb parameters in that specific block. And this will apply for a lot of different reverb algorithms also, so I hope it'll be useful to you. Alright, so first things first, just a look at the general preset before we get into the hall verb, so we know what we're working with. Here's all the settings for the amp block. That doesn't change very much. I've queued up a solo boost on foot switch 3, which increases the drive parameter just a little bit, increases the channel volume for about 4 decibels gain boost, and also engages that simple delay. So that acts as a lead boost. And then we have an always-on compressor here, which I just feel like adds a little bit of life to the amp. And we have an optional Klon-style overdrive queued up for foot switch 2. The input impedance is set at 230K. I find that works well with this guitar, with single coils especially. I talk about that in a lot of videos. And then I have some stereo modulation after the reverb. This new tape effect, which is kind of like the Strymon Deco. And then a Trinity chorus, which is a Dimension chorus, also in stereo. I feel like throwing those after a reverb can be a really cool sound, so I put that in the preset as well. That's for foot switches 4 and 5. So, talking about dynamic hall now, you'll see a ton of parameters here, and I'm just going to run through and discuss a little bit about what each one does. Decay, that one's pretty obvious. So the decay just tells us the amount of time it takes for the reverb to decay by 60 decibels. That's the T60 value. That's a pretty standard definition for decay in a reverb. Typically, we like most things to be between about maybe 2.5 for a short room verb, up to about 7 or 8. After that, it gets really long and washy, which has plenty of uses as well. But generally speaking, the sweet spot's going to be 2.5 seconds, in my opinion, to around 7.5-ish. The predelay is the amount of time between the impulse and the first reflections of the reverb that you hear. So I tend to set it no less than 12 milliseconds. The predelay is really useful in separating the dry from the wet sound. So your dry sound would be no reverb, and the wet sound is all reverb. So by setting the predelay a little bit, it clears up the mix, lets you dial in more reverb without it becoming muddy. Let's listen to the predelay. I'm going to max out the mix parameter here so we can hear what I'm talking about. Here's 12 milliseconds. Relatively instant, right? And then we'll boost it up. I believe the max is 200 here. You can see what I mean. So like I said, this is useful for when you're dialing in a much heavier reverb, more decay, more mix. If you don't want it to get too washy or too muddy, too confusing, dial in some predelay. Start at 12 millisecond and maybe work up to about 40. That can be pretty good to work with. Room size is pretty self-explanatory, 10 meters, 20 meters, 30 meters. A smaller room is going to sound different than a larger room. So although you can queue up this parameter to change with snapshots, as I've done, it's not recommended if you're letting the reverb bleed when you change snapshots, because you're going to hear that pop because the actual algorithm is changing. So this is one that I might not queue up on snapshots ordinarily. A great middle ground is 20 meters. I would set that, and then you can have any of the other parameters change. Let's talk about diffusion and damping. Diffusion is a really common adjustment you'll see on a lot of reverb algorithms if you're using plugins in your DAW or whatever. Diffusion has to deal with the complexity of a reverb and all the reflections that are happening around the room. Picture that you're standing in front of a brick wall 20 feet away or so, and you clap. You're outside, there's no other reflections. You're going to hear pretty much just a clean echo of that impulse coming back to you. Inside a room, you clap, it hits the wall, but it also bounces around, hits the other walls before it gets back to your ear. So you hear the early reflection, which is the initial response of the impulse coming back from the surfaces directly to you. But then you also hear the reverberance, the diffusion of that impulse bouncing off of one surface to another surface and back, or 1, 2, 3 and back, 1, 2, 3, 4 and back to you finally. And this is how we get a much more complex reverb sound. So I'm going to turn this, I'm keeping the decay pretty low. I'm going to max out the mix again, and we'll listen to a low diffusion versus a high diffusion. In essence, a high diffusion is a more complex sound with more reflections. Let me know if I skipped over that too fast, and I'd be happy to clarify it in the comments. Damping has to do with dampening the higher frequencies. So oftentimes, this is a great pedal. I've had this for like 10 years. Strymon has called it high dampening and low dampening. There's a little bit of different controls in the Helix. This is a great pedal because it's very simple to use. They've limited all the parameters. The Helix has a lot more controls. But essentially what the high dampening is doing is choosing the frequency that reflections start to be absorbed. Think about if you're in a tall room with hard surfaces on the ceiling, walls, no carpet, just a hard floor. The reverberance is going to sound very different than if you had carpet or you had canvases on all the walls and stuff. It's just a very different sound. So damping has to do with selecting a frequency and everything above that having a harder time coming through than the lower frequencies. If you ever lived next to a noisy neighbor that was playing with a sound system or something, you can hear a lot of the low frequency noise, but the high stuff doesn't get through the drywall so well. It's a little bit like that. With this damping parameter, I find that the highest I generally want to set it is around 8. You still get some of that artificial high end, but we can deal with that later with a high cut. Anything above that, and it's just too artificial, though you can play with the motion parameter a little bit to warm it up. Diffusion, I forgot to mention this. I feel like diffusion is very useful across the entire spectrum. Feel free to play with that and experiment. Whereas with dampening, I would probably sit between around 3.5, 4K to about 8K for most of your sounds. Obviously, a lower setting is going to sound objectively warmer. Mix is just your control. Everyone knows this. Mix is your control between dry and a wet signal. Motion is a little bit more of a complex algorithm. So it deals with kind of like a spatial thing, but it also introduces modulation the further you get on in the parameter. I'm going to max out the mix parameter here, and we're just going to play with the motion parameter so you can hear all the differences. So I'd say about 5.0 is the point at which you start getting into the modulation side of things. If you want that sound, go past that. If you want a cleaner reverb sending, I wouldn't go any further past 5. So really in this range, about from there to there, is going to be most useful just for kind of warming up the sound. Anything past 5 is going to be where we're actually noticing the modulation, in my opinion. Low frequency. This is going to be our low damp, as if we had this low damp knob from the Blue Sky in this algorithm. The cool thing is that instead of just the volume, like on the Blue Sky, we can actually control the frequency that it selects. I tend to go with 130 hertz. And so what the low frequency and low gain is deciding, it's saying how much of the low frequencies are being reverberated. Are they decaying quicker than the higher stuff? Reverb with a lot of low-end information can get very dense and confusing and clutter the mix. So I tend to keep it at 130 hertz and mix it with a low cut, which is a hard pass. It's saying nothing below 100 hertz is getting out, really. I'll set the low cut at 100, 130 for the low frequency, and then just reduce it just a little bit. If you go any further than -2 decibels, you're going to be missing a lot of essential information, I think. It starts sounding really hollow, right? So I tend to go with these settings here, but you can play around with it a little bit. High cut is saying nothing above this frequency range is escaping. I think we all know what this means by now as well, but I'll listen to it. it can be fun to try and create like a very narrow bandwidth reverb sound. So maybe something like this, and you can mess with the low and high gain, or the damping and the low frequency, low gain settings as well. That's cool. So let's listen to a couple of the settings that I've come up with for the dynamic hall verb. All right, first one. Just a very kind of standard, I feel like, small room sound that would work in a lot of different settings. You've heard this one by now, as we went through earlier. Let's just skip to the second snapshot. This one's going to be a little bit longer. The decay isn't too extreme, but I've set the mix relatively high. For me, this is a high mix, 28%, and I've compensated for it with the predelay, 25 milliseconds. That's enough of a predelay that it's not going to be in the way too much. So this will be great for lead work or very intricate kind of rhythm lines. Rhythm stuff where reverb is playing a huge role in the soundscape, the guitar part especially. If you want to, maybe play with the motion control just a little bit to get a different sound. It warms it up a little bit, and you can actually introduce a little bit more of the higher frequencies through the damping parameter that way also. So yeah, let's go on to the second snapshot. So this one's kind of interesting. This is something you probably couldn't achieve acoustically. I've set the room size really big at 30 meters and then set the decay very low. So this is kind of counterintuitive, you would think. For whatever reason, it works, and you can set the mix parameter even higher than before. Reverb is still going to be a very prevalent part of this sound. It's not going to get buried very easily, but it's still not going to be in the way too much, I feel like. So there's my third snapshot. Fourth snapshot is going to be a really long reverb. You'll notice that the decay parameter goes all the way from 0.1 seconds, hardly noticeable at all the way up to infinity. So what I've done with this preset, with this snapshot, is we have a very long hall verb with plenty of pre-delay, so it's not so much in the mix. It's going to be kind of like a pad. So what I might suggest doing is limiting the notes that you're playing in the low range so it doesn't get cluttered, right? That ends up just being confusing. Rather, just play one note in the low end, and then you can play the higher chord tones. I feel like it works really well for just creating like an atmosphere, a pad of sorts. And so that's my settings for the fourth one. So there it is, my own in-depth walkthrough to using the dynamic hall reverb and tuning each algorithm. Let me know if you had any questions about anything that I might have skimmed over too fast. I'm pretty great at getting back to people in the comments. If you like the sound that you heard in this video and you want to pick up that preset, I threw it in my complete preset library sampler. It's a collection of, I usually say like 50 plus presets, though I haven't counted recently. It's got to be around 70. It's just a ton of presets that I keep adding to this Google Drive folder each time I make a new video, or if I come up with a preset for my own use in whatever gig I'm on at the moment. I just throw it in that folder and everyone gets free updates from now and until forever. So you can check that out at the link in the description. Obviously, if you've bought it in the past, you can go to that Google Drive folder and just pick up the new updates for the library. If this video was helpful, I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. I have a ton of Helix tutorials, preset walkthroughs, live shows with the Helix, and free presets and stuff floating around here that you might dig also. By doing that, it tells YouTube that this was a useful video, and it might recommend it to someone else that it's useful to as well. Anyway, take care, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.